Well, hello, Alistair. We're actually both in London today, although I'm one side of London and you're the other side of London. And we are going to talk today about week three of the Sewing Bee, the Great British Sewing Bee. Now, we were supposed to be joined by Sarah Payne, but unfortunately she's been double booked this week. So she won't be joining us, so that you've got just the two of us. But this is going to be the ideal opportunity where I'm going to ask questions that I'm sure the people watching this want to know the answer.
I forgot I'm double booked as well. You'll have to, yeah, bye.
Don't leave me. I'll break into song. No, 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 no.
Yes, some of it were swanning around London, eating in Italian restaurants and theatering the WI, and then tell everybody. So you had that that massive WI thing at the Royal Albert Hall, didn't you?
We did. So yesterday, 5,000 ladies descended upon the Royal Albert Hall, and we had our national conference. We were joined by some amazing speakers, including Mel B from the Spice Girls, who was interviewed on stage by Victoria Derbyshire. The theme running through was violence against women, which is one of the WI resolutions. It was an absolutely brilliant day, but what just fills you with joy was listening to 5,000 ladies singing Jerusalem. It just got you. It was then at lunchtime. I think the people of London didn't know what was happening because the majority of ladies walked across to where the Albert Memorial was, sat on the steps having lunch, and you could see the tourist buses coming by and complete strangers taking photographs, not realising obviously what the event was, but this huge congregation of women. So yes, followed by, like you say, fabulous Italian meal, and I went to see the Book of Mormons. So, and one or two, just one or two, yes. And thank you. I'll never see this young man again, but whilst I was in the queue at the Book of Mormons, there was these two young lads behind who were talking. We got on chatting, and one of them was from Washington, which is not too far from where I live. And
I think I'm going to have to start calling you Kimberly Cougar Suleman.
Cougar, yeah. So he was asking if you could take drink into the theatre, and I explained yes, but that we were in the first two rows, so they had to behave themselves. And just before the show started, bless his little cottons, he came with a glass of red wine for me. So I had a lovely time. So Hayden, if you're out there from Washington or anybody knows him, lovely, really lovely, made my night. And you know, it restores your faith in young people. It really does. People have such a downer on young people, but when you meet a young man like that, yeah, brilliant. So yes, excellent night.
Well, and we also have to thank the two young gentlemen that helped us with the app when we were trying to get a glass of wine at Nando's when we were being held up.
That's right. Yes, we did have a business meeting, and we didn't know anything of their food. Just comes. People order on maps, QR codes. What's all this about? Yes, where are the waiters?
but thank you to those young gentlemen as well who navigated it through the whole QR code experience.
Showing our age, Alistair, showing our age.
But now we know what to do.
Yes, exactly. Moving straight into week three, which was the theme this week was holidays. Now, the first challenge was a blouse made out of a recycled tablecloth. And to be honest, it was a good challenge for a change. And they were actually vintage tablecloths. We know already that not everybody gets what they want. It's a bit of a scrum. And one of them was actually commented that you had a white tablecloth and a cream one in the colour. But we're not going to go down that route. I thought what I'm going to do is, as I was watching it, I'm going to pick out questions that I would ask, and I'm sure other people would ask you. And the first one was, they had a pattern which obviously would have a grain line on. Now, normally you would pop that pattern on lengthwise. What do you do when it's a tablecloth and they're asking for the placement to be in a particular place? Can you help us out on that one, Alistair?
Well, my top tip with that would be, so it was quite a so although the top was a relatively simple top in construction, it was quite amazing how a lot of them actually it was quite amazing that sorry, the actual embroidery, sorry, I will make sense. The actual embroidery, when you have it actually placed, that's quite a difficult thing if you want the embroidery to maybe go in a certain direction. So with a lot of those, like linen and cotton, say, mixes, what I would do is I would use a really old-fashioned thing which will wash out. I would use a traditional starch. That is going to really stiffen up your fabric first, which means that when you come to actually sewing it, if you don't have one of these sort of like posh feet and things like that, that will help give you slightly more control. So if you were having to cut it, say, on the bias, and you were having to sew, say, a straight seam into a bias seam, the bias would naturally stretch over. But what that would allow you to do using starch is that would allow you to have a bit more body. I thought it was actually quite I thought it was a nice challenge. And I get why everyone was being very precious about like a table. I know it's about repurposing and actually using things, but I've got things from my gran, like I've got this massive, very intricate and extremely small massive crocheted tablecloth, if you like, and I've kept it all and I've wrapped it up. It's not on display, it's not actually out to be looked at, but I get it out now and again, and I just marvel at my gran's handiwork. So I don't think necessarily just because you've got things in a cupboard that they're just out of sight, out of mind, and that just you have to reuse them. I thought it was quite a difficult challenge in terms of if you didn't get in there sort of like first, then you would have been left with bits and pieces. But then again, there was another thing as well. I saw that it wasn't just tablecloths. There were obviously napkins there. There were, I think I saw somebody with a table runner. And again, it's all about the placement and where you actually are going to place them.
But what about that grain line on the pattern? Would you just, because you've started it, would you just go with the placement rather than normally if you pull your fabric selvage to selvage, you've got a little bit of movement, and your lengthwise grain, you've got less movement, which is normally where you would place that grain line. Would you just say starch it and you'll be okay?
I would say starch would give you you've just got to bear in mind that you actually might get a little bit of a bump on the actual, because usually you would, as a rule of thumb, you would never put a bias edge onto a straight edge, because they're not a match made in heaven. Although the whole point of this challenge was to use an existing, so if you want to say, for instance, if on the actual corner the embroidery was placed in a slightly different way, but you wanted that to be the right way round, then you're kind of fighting with yourself, because most corners, for instance, because it drapes over a table, it's actually, the embroidery is actually on the bias, so it's actually it's because obviously when it falls over the table, it will be the right way up. So if you wanted that to be the right way up on here, rather than the embroidery sort of like pointing away, if you like, or pointing into the corner, I found it quite a sort of like it's a difficult challenge in terms of trying to celebrate the actual embroidery. And there was a few of them that actually did it. I mean, I would have thought that one tablecloth would have been more than enough to actually make an entire blouse.
Depends on the size, though, I suppose, because you can have a big tablecloth and a small one. The other thing I would say to people is, if you are worried about that stretch, then use the Vaseline tapes, because if you were doing a neckline and they were putting bias tape on that neckline, they could have used the bias tape. That would have eliminated any stretch, regardless of how they'd cut that. The shoulders, similarly, they could have used the edge tape, on the shoulders, and again that would have reduced it. And any seams where you're saying putting a bias seam to a straight seam, if they'd use the seam tape flexible, again it would have helped enormously.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that I would suggest doing is that if you've got a bias seam that's going into a straight seam, make sure the bias seam is actually where the feed dogs are.
Yeah.
Just purely and simply because it just naturally, the sewing machine takes a little bit more of the bottom than the top. Also, I would take your time and baste something. If you're doing something that beautiful and delicate, spend the time to baste this together first. We do that with predominantly silks, but we do that more than pinning, just because it gives you far more control, and you'll be guaranteed that your pattern pieces will go together. We're eliminating as much drag as possible.
Excellent. So the other question I'm going to ask you, and again, I'm being more general in this one, is pinning pattern pieces to the fabric. Is that a good thing to do? Is because obviously when you put a pin in, that can create a drag as well, and obviously it's dependent on the fabrics. And I didn't see a great deal of the dressmaking weights. What's your thoughts on pinning a pattern or using dress weights, or have you got, you know, a top tip?
Well, I would always, my best friend is chalk. And if I was pattern matching check, for instance, so say for instance I was making a wool suit, just for an example, and it was a check. What we do in couture and on Savile Row, most people would chalk out, say, the pattern. They would, you know, check that, you know, the check was all lining up and what have you. Well, we go a stage further. So we would mark it on the top. We would put pins through to make sure that the checks on particular points were all matching up. We cut the top layer first, and then we take the cloth off the top layer, and then we check again that when that top piece is sitting on the top, we then know how much it's shifted, because just handling and cutting, it will shift it. So then you can realign it. So that means that your two front panels, if you like, you're getting the check to sit perfectly and exactly on the way. You're also checking the shoulder seams and stuff like that. And that's when basting comes in as well. So if you were doing something like that, once you've chalked something, you can always get the other good tip with, I don't know why it works, but it does. But if you get a scrap of the same fabric, don't use a brush. Ban chalk brushes and clothes brushes. Get a little bit of the same fabric, scrunch it up, and use that to take the chalk off. And what it does is, actually, for some reason, it clears the chalk.
That's an excellent tip. Excellent.
But when you've got a brush, that abrasion, plus you end up, it's too harsh, so you end up stretching fabric as well. So my top tip is, make sure that if you are pattern matching, make sure you chalk first. Then I take the whole pattern and everything, make sure you've transferred all the marks, pins and things like that. When you're cutting, if you've loaded it up with the paper pattern and pins, you're adding extra bulk and layer, and everyone knows you're cutting through. Sometimes when you're cutting curves, the pattern actually is distorting what you're actually working with. So I would always use pattern weights to chalk, and then you can see where you've chalked, cut that out. And if you're pattern matching the same for the other side, which needs to match, then cut the top layer one side off first, double check again. So always check twice, cut once.
Cut once. And the other coming in on this particular challenge, they had to do the sleeve. Now we know that Don, bless his little cottons, did the sleeve wrong, but one of the things they had to do was to gather the sleeve cuff. So they had quite a lot of fabric. Have you got a preference? Gather machine, gather by hand? What's your thoughts about that?
Sometimes it can be a difficult one. I mean, what I actually do, one thing that I actually, one thing I actually hate, excuse me, one thing that I actually hate when I see people doing this, the best thing to do before you eat, so it's entirely personal preference. But what I would actually do is, rather than going all the way around the circumference with one giant stitch, mark quarter sections. So you've got 4 sections, and on each section, put a running stitch just for that small section, and then again for the other ones. You've done 4, if you like. That makes it far easier to actually ruche. But before you've ruched anything or gathered it in, pin the 4 points to where you're. So, say for instance, if it was a waistband of a skirt, pin the center front, center back, and the 2 side seams. You'll have all this excess fabric that you're about to gather in, and then gather each section in by itself. Don't do a huge, great big round one, and then you'll go like this, and then you've got more gathering on one side and then on another, and then it just means you're evenly distributing. Also, with that, sometimes if you've got a lot of gathering, sometimes it's much easier to do 2 lines of stitching.
Right.
And what that actually does is it creates almost like a little mini channel in the middle where you're about to sew. Because sometimes when you've only got 1 line of stitching, what actually happens is that some of the fabric can get caught on the front, end up with little pleats in it where you didn't actually want them, and then that distorts the thing. Then you're unpicking again, but that will just allow. Also, sometimes you can cheat us ever so slightly. I'm not a big fan of gathering thing. What you can use shearling elastic.
Yes, or you can use the shearling elastic, or even the fram elastic would work as well. Yeah.
And sometimes what I've also done as well, I've used maybe a 4-5 millimeter strip of elastic, and what I've actually done is I've sewn that on. That keeps it nice and flat just before you're about to sew it, and then I rip that off. Well, I unpick it delicately, obviously.
So if you're talking about gathering that big area and you've got your 4 points, then I presume you're preferring to gather by hand rather than on the machine. Yeah. Now the thing, obviously, we're coming up, or you're coming up with all of these fabulous tips, and we do know that on the Sewing Bee they had to do this in 2.5 hours, so time is against them. And in fairness to them, the time restraint compared to the challenge sometimes is where the issues lie, and it sets them up for failure. But what we're telling you is what you would do at home if you were go and get your tablecloth and you're wanting to create a garment with that. So we're not being critical of the Sewing Bee contestants on the show, because we know the time is just that clock is just awful. Thanks very much for that. Now the other thing was when we came to the judging, the first time I've known that I can remember where we had a joint winner, and that was Ailsa, and she was commented on having really good placement and really good sewing, and Luke, because it was asymmetrical and they liked the colours. Did you agree with both of those makes?
I did. I thought Elsa's was I thought it was beautifully sewn and beautifully executed, but then again, so was Luke's. I didn't think either of them. I thought they really did. They obviously understood the pattern completely. There's one comment that Esme made. I can't remember whose it was. It was a blue and white one, and she just
looked at Susie's.
Yeah, she just looked at the hem. Oh yeah, it was Susie's actually. She looked at the hem rather than telling Susie what was wrong with it. She says, "Oh, and there's something going on here." And I'm thinking, how long have you been in the fashion industry? It's like, I mean, that I think it was just she was rushing to hem, and she obviously weaked it up a whole inch.
Yeah.
That's where that all went. I would have just left it, to be honest.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I did agree with I did agree with it. But again, this also goes back to the fact that, yes, for production reasons, the pattern challenge should, everybody should have the same, even though they had tablecloths. Some of them had large embroidery, some of them would have had scalloped edges. It takes somebody.
One of them it was commented on, I'm trying to see whose it was, where it was really plain, and she said it looked like medical scrubs. I'm looking through my notes here. It was Pasha's. She said it was neatly sewn, but the pale embroidery, the embroidery paled, and it looked like medical scrubs. Now, that to me wasn't her fault, that embroidery was like that when it was beautifully sewn. And when she came, I think she came 5th. She sat in the middle of the 10. I thought that was really quite unfair, because is it a sewn? It's a pattern challenge. She understood the pattern. The pattern was great. It was just that the tablecloth didn't have that wow factor that the other tablecloths had. So I did feel a bit.
And also, that just spurs my memory back to the comments they made about Janet. Now, Janet, she actually used the tablecloth, but she then used fabric off a bolt, Patrick. It wasn't scraps. She did cut a hole. That's a pretty big scrap, if you ask me, to a hole back in a blouse. But again, it's like sometimes the critiques are blurred between, because one minute they're championing the fact that, oh yeah, the design of this is just so wonderful and blah blah blah, and I'm thinking, but you're supposed to be critiquing them on the sewing. And the comments they made about the really pale embroidery, well then, if you didn't want anyone to choose pale embroidery, then why did you have it on the rail for somebody to potentially choose? It's like you should have had all, strong embroidery, because I mean, if it's very pale, it could be the most beautiful embroidery, and that's why she may have chosen it. Or it could have had her favorite flowers. It could have had flowers that a gran had, or like snowdrops that remind you of a particular person or something, whatever it is. But you can't critique somebody. I mean, but it was well sewn, so they couldn't argue that. It's just they were nitpicking. I just thought that was a little bit, because then obviously sometimes you can really hide behind a bold statement, print and color, and you can make something that might not be as well executed, but it can look so much more. And that sometimes is a trick that we use when we do film costumes, because sometimes you have to come up with something really quickly if the director changes his mind about a scene, and you don't have time to sit there and make a couture gown or outfit. As long as it looks plausible on camera for what it's supposed to do, sometimes we've sewn actors and actresses into the garments because it's just the front that they're seeing. But
we'll move on from that challenge, and we'll move straight into the challenge that always has controversy. We had over 100 comments from the last video. Thank you so much, everybody. And whilst we're talking about that, we've randomly picked a winner, and the winner this week is Ginny Smith. And Ginny, I will send you a message, and if you can then send us some details, we'll send you last week's prize out, which was that lovely Liberty bundle. Similarly, this week, if you've got any comments, questions that we can pose, we'll have another prize. So what's the prize this time?
The prize this week is I used to Liberty's used to commission these. As it's summer, that you've got a full Liberty print. Now there is bias binding in this kit. So you get the full pattern, and these are all different Liberty prints. So you can make your own bunting for the garden or in the thing. And also, just because everyone will be out and about and you won't be spending much time indoors, you've got a mini House of Alistair makeup bag, complete with working zip and tissue in there. If you want to iron that and recycle. Or if you just want to use some, I don't know, interlining that you can reuse the tissue on, so to protect your iron. So there you go. So it's full on. So you just need to comment in the boxes, and somebody next week will announce the winner next week, or who's actually won this little bundle.
That's brilliant. So we're moving on to the transformation challenge, which, oh my goodness, when I saw the pile of stuff, and I've put nautical stuff, and I wanted them to create a bag, but they were very specific about using the ropes creatively. They wanted a holiday bag that was practical and fun. Now, the biggest thing that they came upon almost immediately, and they did focus upon it, was how do you sew slippy fabrics, or fabric that's sticking? If you've got a Teflon coated foot, and if you haven't got one, some of the machines, so obviously I deal with Brother quite a bit. Have you written that down? Teflon coated foot?
Yeah.
Get that on your machine, because then that'll help. You could also use like a slider sheet underneath your machine, which is quite often our patchworkers are using it for free motion quilting. What would work just as well as, like, you know, the silicone bacon sheets, as long as you don't cover up your feed dogs, that works really well. But you can get slider sheets, so that would help enormously. And of course, you could always use a walking foot, which always works with difficult fabrics. So that was my thing straight away, because bless them, they were just having problems, and pulling it through the machine is no good, because your stitches are going to skip. You're going to have some small stitches, you're going to have some big stitches, and ultimately anything that you make isn't going to stay together. So if you use those three things on your sewing machine, that's absolutely fine. Now, they were also sewing mesh. What's your thought? How would you sew mesh onto the fabric that they were using?
Right. So just before we go back to that, because there's an old couturier trick that we use, and this is when you sew loops for bridle buttons in. Obviously the Teflon foot, you mentioned different papers. Back in the day, when we were working with PVC, we would use tissue. And the trick with the tissue, if you're using dark colors, use black. If you're using light colors, use white. And what you can do is, if the easiest, rather than ripping the tissue off like that, what you can do is, if you boil a kettle, if you run the tissue over, it moistens it ever so slightly. And what that does is, rather than it's sort of like tearing with bits, when you actually slightly moisten it, I'm not talking about getting a full-on bottle spray out, but when you give it that little bit of extra moisture, it actually pulls apart rather than ripping apart. So you're less likely to get bits stuck in your stitching. So there's a little tip with that. You can also get silicone sprays and all sorts of different things. So when you're working with things like mesh and things like that, it depends on how open the actual weave itself is. However, you're not really going to do anything quickly with it. So it's all about hand sewing it into place. Like, for instance, bridal loops on the back of evening dresses and what have you, we hand sew those all into the seams before we actually stitch it. One, that gives you far more control that you've actually got the loops the right way. But it also means, if you are using, say, that really open net, then you're well placed to actually be putting it. If you did want to do a cheat sway, you can buy products which are water soluble. So could bond the netting between two water soluble sheets, if you like, and then that would give you one solid fabric, which means you don't have to pin it in place, because it's a solid sheet, and once it gets wet or you wash it, then the sheets disintegrate, and you're left with the actual that would get it in really quickly, and in fact that would probably be quicker than hand sewing it into place. But it depends what you're actually doing with it. I mean, interestingly, they said rope was such an integral part. The actual person that won the only rope that was even on that particular bag, now looking at it, was that tiny little mesh, roped front, if you like. But they were banging on about how that's too simple, that's too this, that's too what have you, that's not an interesting way of using rope. And I'm thinking, yeah, the bag construction, yeah, it was clever in terms of 1 minute it's a rucksack, the next minute it's a tote bag. But if you actually strip it back, the brief was you had to use rope in an interesting way.
The person who did use rope in a very interesting way, in my opinion, was Georgie, who made the rope coil purse, which was to go onto a key ring inside a bag. And then she also integrated rope into the construction of a bag. So the one who probably created something brand new, usable and practical was Georgie, although she came fourth in the listing. So Alex, as you said, had won. Janet was criticised because hers was too simple. It was just a boot bag with a long rope, and it was a very, very long rope. And when Esme had it, I mean, Esme is a very small person. Have you got any thoughts for the other ones? I mean, it's a challenge that I really... Normally I can write 3 or 4 pages of notes, and I'm less than 2 pages on this one. I didn't think it was the best. I was really looking forward to a bag, because there's a lot of patchwork and quilters, and there's a lot of people who aren't dressmakers who watch the Sewing Bee challenge, and I was really disappointed with what they gave them to work with, was number 1, and then making rope the main feature was number 2, because rope on the sewing machine would have been extremely difficult. They had to go to hand sewing, and they had an hour and a half. So
I mean, there's lots of things that they could have used. There was only one contestant, and I've forgotten who.
What was it?
I think actually I've forgotten her name. She's a very pretty girl. She's got the plaited hair.
Oh no, is it? Oh, I'm going to say the wrong names. Anyway.
It was a green bag with a sort of off kilter sort of pocket, and she was plaiting.
Yes.
She was actually plaiting the actual rope, but she actually used it as an actual surface decoration. I mean, that's what you can do. I mean, for instance, there's a.
Was that the round bag? Was that the round bag?
No. That the round bag had Susie's. Eyelashes almost sort of like coming off it. This bag was a normal sort of bag, but she'd actually plaited the rope to make it thicker, so that it created more sturdy handles.
Oh, I know who you mean. Yes.
But she'd also used it on the front of the actual pocket itself. Now, for instance, on Savile Row, we use braid, essentially a rope. And when we're creating the fleur-de-lis on gents smoking jackets, and those have to be, and the fleur-de-lis, the square in the center, it has to overlap, where no one is overlapping twice, so it's all perfectly interlocked, and that's one piece of cord. That took me quite a few years to skillfully get that. Plus, you also have to, when you're stitching rope or braid, you have to twist it so it gets almost hard, and that will give you a crisp, a very, very crisp thing. For instance, I remember now I used to have to use two pieces for the fleur-de-lis circles there, and then a 10p piece on the top. And if they were not inaccurate in size and match on both sides, it was rejected, and I would have to do it again. And in some cases, because we were using velvet, I would have, if they were so wrong, if I couldn't unpick it carefully, I'd be charged for some silk velvet to recut the entire sleeve. That it was really quite whatever. But I thought that, I think they've got to remember what they're setting the challenge about. They to tell everyone you've got to make a bag, but they wanted you to use rope in a very creative and an innovative way.
Innovative. Oh.
Yeah, I've never been able to say that word. I sort of like, you know, but yeah, I just thought, yeah, the bag that won, yes, it was clever in concept, but did it actually fit the brief? I mean, I know I'm being a bit nitpicky, but it was a bit. I thought it was a little. I'm finding sometimes that what they set the challenge as and what the outcome is and who actually wins. Sometimes it's a bit skewed in terms of like personal preference.
Yeah. So the last challenge was the pattern fit, and they get 4 hours for that. And the theme was French Riviera. If you've never been to the French Riviera, which some of the contestants hadn't been to the French Riviera, you maybe were at a disadvantage there. Now, it was supposed to be nostalgic glamour, with detail, and they wanted a complicated garment. Now, when they said garment, that could either be a dress or trousers or a top. But some of them, and the ones who were obviously against the clock, decided that they would make an outfit. So before we go into, you know, who won, there was one of the girls, Lauren, she used chiffon, and she made that nice, although it was criticized because it didn't quite fit under the crotch was short and the bottom was a little bit tight. But yeah, just a little bit. But when it comes to sewing with chiffon, what's your top tip for that?
Right, I just want to clarify something up before we sort of move on. And this is something, well, actually men in this day and age now, because men are just as fashion conscious as women. And I think men also, I mean, I'm guilty of it myself. I have, you know, a lot of, there's parts of my body that somebody else would go, I don't know what you're talking about. You know, that's silly. I'm conscious of certain parts of my body, just like everybody else. So I'm just normal like everybody else. Please, 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 everyone, stop looking at sizes. They are a guide. And tight does not mean it fits you well. Tight, in this instance, I felt that the model she had, which was of Afro-Caribbean descent, well, I don't know that I don't exactly know where the model was actually from, but when you're dealing with that, so that's a very different body shape. And obviously, when you've got somebody who is, say, of the same descent as well, you know where you need to sort of allow extra sort of bits and pieces. Like, for instance, trouser construction for Afro-Caribbean men and ladies is slightly different. There's a bit extra tolerance that you need to actually give for the fit. I felt that was slightly a bit too tight. And if it were me, I would not have pleated the chiffon into shorts, because for me there was too much bulk there. I would have put it into the waistband and created and then that would have looked far more elegant in my opinion. So you've got that aspect, but sewing chiffon, a lot of people do get a little bit self-conscious about it. The zigzag stitch, if you want to cheat with French hems, that's quite cheat on a sewing machine. If you wanted to use a baby overlocker, I would suggest sewing the seam first and then go down with your overlocker. Don't overlock first, or go straight in there unless you're really competent in terms of going in there with a double needle and doing it that way around. Chiffons actually, because, you know, they used to make parachutes in the First and Second World War, and those were made out of silk. So in actual fact, silk is such a tough fabric. And just because it's see-through doesn't mean it's not strong. You can really tug at chiffon. It's a really silk is a really robust fabric. So don't get too, you know, bombed out about the fact that, oh, I've got to be so delicate. Yeah, it will slip and slide. But as I say on TV, get yourself hero product of the year. Go out and get some calico. Put that on your table when you're resting your chiffon or slippy fabrics onto it. This calico acts like an abrasion, and it means that it holds the underpiece, and it means you can delicately use your fingers to make sure that your other pattern pieces are actually aligning properly, and then baste those together.
Excellent. The other thing was, you've just touched very quickly on a French seam. So anybody who doesn't know what a French seam is, it's obviously a seam that's neat. And the way you sew it, and it's something that you have to really get your head round, because normally when you sew a seam, you would put right sides together. So if you've got pretty fabric, the right sides together. With a French seam, you sew wrong sides together first. Then I tend to trim back that seam a little bit, and then I put it right sides together, and you're sewing again another seam, but all of the raw edges are captured. So as it's a great technique for clothing, but also a great technique if you want to do a very simple bag and not necessarily put a lining in it. French seams are good. So so I just thought I'd touch on that, because sometimes we use terminology that we know but not everybody else knows. You also said baby overlocker, and did you mean 2 threads or 3 threads on your overlocker? Is that what you referred to there?
Yeah, I mean, just to touch on I remember having a conversation with you quite a few months ago, before we even started this, and I was telling you about how we strengthen French seams. And a lot of people think, for instance, in the couture world, that, oh well, you just get yards and yards of silk and fabric and what have you, and you just sort of like, because it's expensive anyway, you're just cutting and it's lavish, and it's no. In actual fact, we're actually really tight. So for instance, we don't even throw the selvage edge away. So we actually strengthen French seams. Now, this is a real skill. But when you're actually, so when you've got your wrong sides together, when you're actually sewing, you actually sew into that seam before you then fold it back to so it's right sides facing. We add that selvage. We cut all the hairy bit off. We add that selvage in there. That selvage is the strongest stay tape that you will ever have. And in fact, even if we weren't using it for the construction of one garment, we would keep the selvage edges, because if you needed to, for instance, for a top going right all the way down the neckline, we'd use that. Nothing's wasted. So yeah, so my other tip with French seams, take your time with them. Once you've sewn and cut it, fold it over and lightly press it out, and then baste it, and then go down. If you just sort of go, oh, I'm just going to go like this, that's fine on cotton. But when you're using chiffons, even if it's a polyester chiffon or what have you, make sure you delicately press it first. Don't necessarily have to baste it, but if you press it, you've got all that seam going out. And don't get too trigger happy about snipping too close to your actual seam allowance.
And what about the overlocker? So overlockers traditionally have 4 threads. So you have your upper looper, your lower looper, your right and your left needle. I'm saying most, there's a lot of them will go down to 3 threads. So that leaves you your lower looper, your upper looper, and your right or left needle. And some will actually do 2 threads, but that's the high end overlockers. If you are overlocking, I would definitely just be using 3 threads max on that overlocker. Agreed?
I wouldn't use what have you. I personally, unless you are somebody who has been sewing that one seam in a factory for 20 years and that's all you've actually ever done in the factory, that's your job, then I would stay away from using the overlocker to completely and utterly stitch it. Also, you've got to remember that chiffon and fabrics like that, before you actually hem it, you need to let it rest, because it actually falls. It finds its natural weighting, and it can be really wavy. So you might spend all this time pin hemming all the way around. When you come back the next day, it's all sewn in the waistband or what have you, but your hem is suddenly like this, which is not what you want. So there's a few different principles that you have to have when you're sewing those types of fabrics. But I would do a straight stitch first, and then I would then go in, and I always do that regardless of whether I'm using cotton or what have you. I always do a straight stitch first, and then I overlock second.
So the other thing, rather than going into all of it, the different ones, again, as I say, because we haven't got another guest, the other thing I wanted you to answer a question for was Pasha did a top and trousers, and she used scuba fabric for the top. And now people immediately think of scuba diving. So can you explain very quickly scuba fabric?
Okay, so scuba fabric is exactly what the title suggests. But nowadays there are so many different types of scuba, and especially since the fashion industry has sort of like clutched onto scuba. Now, scuba is a fabric that fit and flare, it will give you a nice 3D element and a nice 3D shape. It's not necessarily, when you're dealing with a wetsuit, yes, you want it to be tight, but when you're dealing with a garment that you're actually going to wear maybe to a function and what have you, you don't want it ultra tight. Now, scuba comes in lots and lots of different guises. For instance, there are scuba crepes, which look more like an actual fabric, but it still has it's still quite thick in terms of these 2-3 mil thick, so it's not like a normal fabric, like a normal crepe be like 0.10 of a millimeter in thickness. Then you've got heavier ones which you could use for your bag making, or if you're doing a really sculptural skirt. So there's things called neoprene, which again are in the same sort of family. But when you look at neoprene, it has a scuba out, an outer, a scuba inner, but in between it almost has like it's almost like a sponge level in between. So they're part of the scuba family. They are great for bag construction. It's great for making makeup bags. Again, with scuba, a lot of the scuba is you don't actually have to finish the hems. You don't have to overlock them. It's a very forgiving fabric. And also, if you're worried about maybe cellulite or little lumps and bumps or, little dimples, I've got a few dimples I'd like to hide.
Got a lot.
Yeah. So literally, scuba is a great fabric for that. Like some fabrics, when they cling to the body, it shows everything up.
Yes.
But scuba is a really, really good fabric to experiment with and actually just have a go. Now, the top that was constructed, scuba was not the fabric choice that should have been used for that top. Also, I think I got really concerned about this end challenge because they only asked for a garment. It wasn't an outfit. And I'm thinking, why didn't you just say to everybody it has to be an outfit? Because some people made a rod for their own backs. Luke, for instance, when he made a comment, I can whip out a shirt in 60 minutes or something like that, I'm thinking, might not be knocking at your door for a production run. But when you saw the execution of like the patch pocket, I wouldn't even have put that on. I on that broderie anglaise, I would have just left the pocket off because it was so big. I agreed with the fact that the collar looked quite big, but the rest of them, some of them went super easy. The one that, because this is a fitting challenge as well, within this challenge, because there was volume and stuff like that, there were a lot of places to hide. But the more simplistic something is, the harder it is to actually get that fit right. And in actual fact, Alex, who made this sort of like giant sort of like romper suit, I actually hang on a second, somebody's rudely trying to call me.
I know, I've had that a couple of times, sorry.
Yes.
We are on iPhones today, so I do apologise if there's been any little blips through this.
Exactly.
Yes,
so
I commented straight on about Alex's jumpsuit loose fitting again. I put that is her thing.
Yeah, but if you look
at dresses.
Yeah, but for instance, if you look at the top over the bust, that was so big. And it was gaping at the side. That did not fit at all. Now, that was a really simple thing to actually, I mean, because of the construction of the garment, it was all beautiful and clean in the way that it was produced. But I'm sorry, but that's the only thing that I couldn't sort of forgive. I was thinking over the bust area, even though you've got the straps, that should have pulled in at the side. And that out of all of them, that was a very simple fit exercise to do. You only needed to take that in, preferably if there was side seams, just take it in ever so slightly, just so that that band actually sat on the bust properly, because it was gaping. I thought the trousers that one were quite interesting.
Yeah, they were. I mean, they did have the wow factor, and they did fit lovely around the tummy in the bottom. The comments there were brilliant trousers, very impactful, elegant, complex with pleats and folds, and they were. But the good thing with her was she had actually only made the trousers. She didn't make the top, and that's where she was able to spend that 4 hours, which is not a lot of time. If you're sitting at home and you're starting from scratch, 4 hours, I couldn't do it in 4 hours on a personal level. So to actually concentrate on that one garment. Now it goes back to, we've been told in the past that they're always advised with regards to fabrics. One would assume that they submit those patterns. Why weren't they told, and somebody may be able to answer this in the future, why weren't they told not to, just one? Because we just need a garment. And it's no good. Yes, you've got to push yourself, and I understand all of that. But she won because she concentrated on that one garment, and she didn't have time to have made a top as well. So in 4 hours. So I actually wrote down, probably halfway through that last challenge, who was going home and who was going to win. And it's not, it was obvious. Now, yes, it's editing, and we can pick up on the editing, but I agreed that Janet should go home, and I agreed that Ailsa should win the garment of the week. Are you in the same camp?
Yeah, I mean, I just felt, I mean, I tell you who was a bit of a dark horse, was Don, actually, the trousers he produced. And again, this just shows initiative, and it's actually quite correct what he was saying. For instance, you don't need always an inner seam and an outer seam. If you can cut a whole trouser, especially if it's a relaxed fit, then there's no reason why you can't cut each trouser leg all in one piece. And those trousers were beautifully fitted when you actually saw a bit of those. And again, if you'd just taken the top off, in fact, I think what the judges should have done, anyone that had gone and made a top, they should have asked the model, because they were wearing blacks underneath, they should have asked them to take the top off and look at the one garment that they had all spent a lot of time on. But then again, when you looked at Luke's trousers, the execution and fit wasn't there for his model. I did think Janet. I did think Janet's times. However, Marcus did not have a very good week this, and I think he really struggled. And also, his end garment essentially didn't lift it up. But I would be a bit hesitant if I was wearing that. If a gust of wind got up, if I was in the Riviera, I think a few folk would get a little bit more than they bargained for. But
and actually, the hem was really ruched as well, so it did stretch. So straight away, the fabric he was using, had he used some stabilizing, some seam tape around there, then it would have stabilized that, because you could see where it had stretched and twisted all the way around. So yes. So I'm gonna just wrap this up for this week, because obviously we've spent a lot of time. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. If you've got any comments, please make them, because we've got a lovely giveaway. Now, next week we have Wendy Gardner joining us. Wendy actually wrote one of the first Sewing Bee books, and it goes back to they are not giving us the techniques and tips because apparently the pattern for the blouse is in the book that's just been released at the moment, although a lot of people are having trouble on that pattern. And I'm going to ask Wendy next week about the books and how they come about. But next week is reduce, reuse, recycle. There's a multi-piece pattern, got clothes to transform, and I've got wedding dress. They have to do something with a wedding dress as well. I have no idea. So we'll see what happens next week on the Sewing Bee. So thank you so much, Alistair, for your time this morning. Thank you for all your tips as well, because I always learn something when I'm talking to you. And as I say, if anyone's got anything that they want to know about, then please ask. Now, what we're also going to do is we're going to release some of the videos that I've done with regards to the Vliseline tapes, because we talk about them, and yes, we take them on TV and they're for sale through House of Alistair, but sometimes it's nice just to have that little bit extra education with them as well. So keep watching on the House of Alistair YouTube channel, because we're going to release some of these technique videos to help you as well. So
and remember,
sorry.
Just quickly remember, so on last week, yes, the code was slightly wrong. So for House of Alistair, you get 15% off, and it's capital BEE, so B, and then 15. That will get you 15% off the entire website, even on sale products, because that was one of the comments that came in as well. So even if it's on sale, you'll get a further 15% off. So just have a little nosy, and it's all across the Vliseline products as well.
And I'm right in saying that your P&P is only £1.50.
Yes, we House of Alistair has only ever asked for a contribution of £1.50 P&P, and just because we can.
Excellent. Well, I'll still look forward to seeing you next week. So
yes,
take care, everybody, and thank you very much. Coming in to stop. Hang on a second. This could take us a few minutes.
Okay.